All right, so I've got my poses, and I'm just going to create a new document. And like I said, there are kind of a lot of steps to this, so I put on Canvas a instruction sheet that kind of steps through all of these. I'm going to go through it, but what I'd like you to do is try and do it yourselves, because it's a good skill for, you know, I don't think it has probably very much bearing on the project you're working on right now, although I suppose it could. But it's kind of a fun technique once you get it set up. So, create a new project. Save those. And import my mouth shapes file. So I've got my mouth shapes. I'll use my mouth shapes 2. Whenever you select that, you need to make sure that you import it as not footage, but composition, and you retain the layer sizes. And when you import it, there's all the different layers that were set up in my Illustrator file. And if I open the composition, there's the entire thing. And I left my reference chart in there just so that I can go back and reference it if I need to. But I am going to turn that one off. Just transparency. So I've got all of these different poses. The first thing I need to do is, so within this composition, all of the poses are going to be stacked one on top of each other, because we're going to transition, basically turn one off and another one on as we work our way through the animation. So I'm going to select all of these, and if I go to my Align panel, I'm just going to align these layers to the composition, and I'm going to center them vertically and horizontally so they're all over top of each other. And I really don't need this entire composition size. It'll be harder to work with the larger it is. So I can actually crop a composition, which is something we haven't really looked at yet. But if we take a look at, again, it's right here in the composition window. This icon right here is referred to as a region of interest. So if I click on that, I can actually draw out the area that I want to use. It's the same as cropping in other applications. Do that. Wait, region of interest. Let's do that again. Switch this to black so I can see. Draw around that. And then if I go to my composition menu, I can crop the comp to the region of interest, and that'll resize that element. And there's a few things I need to do to this. First thing is I've got a fairly long composition here, so I'm going to actually just shrink this down to about, I have 9 different poses, which is going to equate to 9 different frames. So I'm just going to set this to about, I'm just going to set it to a second to start with, just to get it shorter. And then what I'm going to do is select all of my pose layers here. And if I hit Option and right bracket on my keyboard, it's going to shorten all of those instances to a frame apiece. And then if I right click on it, go down to Keyframe Assistant, I can sequence these layers and it will step them all out into that timeline. So if I drag my playhead, I've kind of done the first step to making all of my individual mouth movements. I really don't need any more than this length, so I'm just going to kind of drag my work area down, and I'm going to crop my composition to match that. Trim the comp. And the only other thing I might want to do is, when you watch somebody speak and you think about the anatomy of the head, you know, the skull itself stays in place. So the top lip always stays in one position. It's the bottom, it's the jaw that moves mostly, right? So aside from the lips doing certain things within certain sounds, basically that top lip always kind of stays in the same spot. So if I just sort of draw a guide down here to where my top lip is, I'm going to take a moment and just sort of go through and slide each of my poses to kind of match that guide. This I'm going to slide just a little bit down. This is one of those where I think the lips do a little bit more work, so I'm going to let the lips sort of stick above that for that O's kind of sound. But the rest of these I'm just going to kind of align up. I mean, you know, an awful lot of motion graphics is observation, you know, watching what things do watching how things behave when they're doing a certain thing, you know? So this may not, you know, the top lip being in one spot is at least a good starting point. It may not always be that way, but generally speaking, it does. So now if I kind of work my way, I need to do that again, dummy. I had all of my layers selected rather than just the one I wanted to move. All right. So, need to pay attention. Slide him down, grab that, bump him up. That's probably good. Him up, and that'll be good. So now that top lip is pretty much in the same spot all the way across. And for the most part, that's the basic setup on our mouth shapes by themselves. All right. So that's a step on the mouth shapes. We basically brought this in, we've centered all of our poses on top of each other, cropped it down, and then we sequenced these layers to an appropriate number of frames. So it's basically, I had 10 poses, each pose is a frame, so I've got 10 units, which is a number we're going to want to remember. So now, I'm just going to go ahead and create a regular composition, and I'll make this in about 6 seconds or so, something like that. And then, so we can see our mouth shapes. Drop kind of a light color into it. And then we'll just drag that mouth shapes pose down on top of the composition and size it. And I've also got a set of eyes that we can drop in here as well. Something like that. So the nice thing about this process is that I'm using it for a mouth, but I can animate eyes the same way. So find a sort of a collection of eye poses for different things, angry, crying, upset, whatever, surprised. Illustrate those out individually, and the process is entirely the same. I'm not going to do it with these ones, these are just static, but you can use it for that. I mean, there's any number of other things you can actually use the process for. If you've got static poses you want to animate a character between, say you've got an animation style where you don't necessarily want to articulate them in a natural way, but you want it to be a little more stop motion like, you could use this same process to kind of set stop motion poses of individual characters. So a lot of uses beyond just the mouth, but it's a fairly flexible way of doing it. So, all right. So with our mouth shapes, there's some other stuff we need to do here. And one of them is, if you remember in my example, I showed you that we control the mouth shapes with a slider, so that all we have to do is move the slider and animate it. So that's one of the first things we're going to do. So we get back into some expressions here, which can be a bit of a challenge. But like I said, I've got a sheet on Canvas that kind of outlines all of these, so you don't really need to worry about it too much. But I'm going to start with my mouth shapes. I'm going to go to the Effect menu, down to Expression Controls, and at the very bottom there's a slider control. So I'm going to select that, and it's going to add a slider up here to my mouth shapes. And if I open Effects, you'll see that here's that slider control as well. So it exists in both locations. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing we need to do is that we've got each of these poses on individual frames. So we want to remap how that behaves. So I'm going to right click on my mouth shapes and go to time. I'm going to enable time remapping. And it comes in with the stopwatch active. And then we're just going to take if we option click on that stopwatch, that'll open up our expression line. I'm just going to grab that pick whip and drag it up and connect it to that slider. And then I've got to modify the expression. So I'm going to modify the expression to be A equals the expression that it had in there in the first place. And at the end, go away. And at the end, I'm going to type frame to time. And if you actually just type frame, it'll give you some options here. So I'm going to select frames to time. And what I'm going to tell it is that I'm going to use A as a variable within this expression. I put that A equal in front of this effect line. A is a variable, if you know anything about coding and programming. But that's a variable. Frame to time, we're going to define A as frame to time. So now when I go back up here to my slider, if I open this up, all I have left to do is, if I right click on it, on slider, I'm going to say edit value. And if you remember, I've got 10 frames for each pose, 1 frame for each pose. So I'm going to change the slider range from 0 to, instead of 100, to 10 frames. Basically, that'll mean that each slider position will be the equivalent of 1 frame. Say OK. And now if I pull this slider across, it's switching between each of my poses. And actually my last one was a blank, so, which I'll leave, so I've got my neutral and then my different poses all the way through. And the only other thing that I really kind of need to do is make sure I do this one right. It's a lot of steps. So I'm going to actually, what I'm actually going to do through this, I can actually pull this out here to match my timeline length. I can pull that out. I don't think I really need to, but. So I'm going to use the slider control now. I'm just going to set my first keyframe. I'm going to make one additional change to that. I'm going to right click on that, go under right here, toggle hold keyframe. Basically what this is going to do is, it's the equivalent of whenever we animate a type and we just change the source text. It's the same kind of thing. Basically every keyframe, it's going to change to that particular pose, that each keyframe I set, and it's going to hold there until I change it again. So I'll do that. And then it's just really a matter of going through and to an audio line, I'll slide each time I change my pose as I work my way through, it adds a new keyframe. And I use that process to start animating. And it's really just a matter of, from this point forward, placing your audio line, taking a look at the waveform, and animating to that waveform. So I'm going to grab my eyes and drag them up out of the way and eliminate all of those. So I've got a couple of different soundtracks in here. Somewhere. Actually, I'll bring this one in. So if I drag this down in, so the audio that I have is
1, 2.
Actually, let's bring in the alphabet instead. Go to File, Alphabet.
A, B, C.
And if I open that up, just like when we were looking at audio lines and animating type, we've got this waveform. I really kind of think the simplest way to start is that your mouth is always going to start in a neutral pose. And anytime you hit a spot where there's no audio, you're going to have a neutral pose as well. So usually what I'll do is I'll identify those areas and I'll just kind of start off with those. So if I go back over here to my effect control, and on this slider I can just hit this little keyframe button over here just to add a neutral keyframe. I'll set one here. And now I'll worry about the movement in between those. So A is kind of an open mouth kind of a thing. So I'll just drag my playhead there, slide through my slider. No. A. Probably another thing that would have been useful is to sort of rearrange my poses into similar shapes. Would probably make them easier to find. That's another step you can do while you're setting up your initial mouth composition. So then we
A, B,
A, B, A, B. Sort of pay attention to your own mouth when you speak them out loud. This is the premise for people talking to themselves. Set that. Let's see if that's A, B, do B there.
A, B, C.
And you just kind of match movements up. So in a slow-paced kind of a thing like this, it's not all that difficult. And actually, animating out the alphabet is a good way to get used to doing this process. But you can also take some of these other poses and use them as kind of intermediary steps, because right now it's just, it's closed, open, closed again. So I could take this pose right here, maybe toss it in right in between these two. Whenever you'd say A, your mouth comes back down, closes. So we could use that to sort of complete that motion.
A, B, A, B.
If that's our neutral, we could probably use that as an intermediary there.
B, C.
And if they're not hitting quite right,
B,
you just kind of move them around.
B, C. A, B.
And they kind of start to pick up different motions. Slower paced clips are easier to animate, I think, than faster paced clips. And one of the things you kind of want to avoid is trying to place a movement every single frame, because they move quick enough that you really kind of lose the effect. So every 2 frames or so, 2 to 3 frames, seems to be good spacing. But if you've got a faster paced piece of audio, then you got to kind of adjust accordingly. And that's where you probably just wouldn't do as many of these intermediary steps. You'd let each of the movements be a little bit quicker, a little more obvious. And once you set up a mouth rig as well, you find a set of mouth shapes that work for you, you can pretty much save that and import that into other projects as well, so you don't have to redo that whole setup process every single time. But the more you do it, the better off you get at it. I've done it probably a dozen times, and I still have to always refer back to something. So there's just all these little steps.
A, B.
So you can just animate each of those different poses. So like I said, the alphabet's easy enough. If I bring in, I'll grab these both. I'm not sure which is which.
I apologize.
That's the one I want. So for that, I'll just create, so I've got one composition with the alphabet in it. Create another comp. Use solid as a background. And rather than do that entire mouth setup again, I'm just going to go back into here, grab this mouth shapes that I already set up, copy it, paste it into this one, and I'll just have to go through and remove my keyframes. So I can use this rig to animate to this sound effect. So let's drag him in. Open up that waveform.
I apologize for yelling at you.
And just kind of do that whole same process over again, but we're going to kind of pay attention to a lot of these different states. So select my mouth shapes. Open it up. It's got my first keyframe set, which is closed.
I apologize.
So just kind of look through, listen to each of those, listen to that clip. And work your way through. Move that up. Back to neutral.
I apologize.
Apologize is sort of pursed lips. This is where probably an intermediate, another pose would be helpful. BP. And listen to each of the syllables. Apologize. P, O. So maybe we'll do
I apologize.
and
Apologize.
got it. Apologize actually stretches out across these two waveforms. It's also helpful too within your timeline, identify where particular phrases start?
I apo-
Yep, got everything okay. Thank you. So apologize starts there. Select my audio line. Control 8 will add a marker up here onto my timeline, and if I double click on that, I can mark what that element is. So apologize starts here. Control 8 will add a marker. Control 8. And even though it's apologize, he says apologize. So usually I'll just try to phonetically type in what it is he says, because that kind of gives me a clue as to what shapes I want. Even though it's an O, he says it was sort of that southern A drawl. And you can mark your audio line.
apologize for yelling.
Oops. Actually, it'll drop that marker. So I had the marker set, I had my audio line selected when I was placing those markers. I had deselected it. If you don't have anything selected, it'll drop that marker up in the very top of your timeline window. But I find it easier to place it on the audio track, because if I decide I want to shift when that audio starts, then all of my markers go with me, and I can adjust my timing on my clip or on my mouth shapes the same way. So as long as I have them here, if I decide that this really needs to come in a little bit later, and I move that, say 10 to 20 frames, I've still got the markers on my audio line that I can go down here to my mouth controls, select them all, and then just slide them over to match it back up again. So markers can be pretty helpful just in identifying, so you're not always, that at least allows you to roughly set things up. And, you know, the motions here,
I apologize for
it's very hard to tell if you've got it right over just a couple of different motions. You really got to kind of rough the entire thing together, watch it, see which areas are working and see which ones aren't, and then adjust your keyframes to match. And a lot of times it's not, again, it's just kind of that you know, eye to ear kind of a coordination. It might look one way on the waveform, but it comes across a different way whenever you actually watch it and listen to it. But the waveform is a good way to at least get set up and you get stuff in the right general vicinity. And then you can move on. So this one, right, this keyframe or this marker I set up here, whenever I moved all this, it didn't move with my timeline. So if I actually just right click on that, I can delete it and select my timeline, set this one. The other thing we see from the waveform is that even though there are individual words spoken all the way through it, for yelling at you, or at least the for yelling at part, all kind of blends together into one word, if you will. At least by the waveform it does. You know, there's a very obvious break in these earlier ones, but this sequence of words here, the mouth will never really fully close. So you just kind of work your way through. Let's see, so 4, that F. Actually, I'm going to set, I don't think his mouth really ever closes all the way through it, but we'll set that, grab our mouth shapes, close that. Here we'll start with this FV kind of shape for E. In. Yeah.
For yelling at you.
It's like most anything. I'll set the ones that I know, and then I'll work my way back into the more complicated areas.
At you. For yelling at you. For yelling at you. For yelling at you.
It's fairly close.
I apologize for.
That's not. So just go back, work your way through. Maybe one motion, one shape doesn't really seem to work very well. And adjust them as you need to. I think that. But if I zoom all the way in here, you'll see that I really don't, I've got about a gap of 1.5 frames on this one, which would probably be better at 2. You just kind of time it up the best you can. Like I said, more mouth poses would probably be better. There's a few sounds in here that would be better for a different shape, but I tried to do it in fewer as opposed to more. So what I'd kind of like for you to do is set up a mouth rig, and I'll go through the whole process again. The elements for it, though, are up on Canvas. There's if you look in Canvas under today's lecture, there's mouth movements, which is an AI file. It's probably the easiest one to use. The PSD is okay, but the AI one's the one that I use for my demo. So once you download that, let's download, let's see, mouth movements and save them. Mouth movements and I think I put an audio up there. Let me check. Let's try this again. All right, I can't see what I put up there, so actually, use my phone. Yeah. So download that, the mouth shapes, and then go ahead and open an After Effects project. And import that Illustrator file. So when you import the file, I think mouth shapes is the one that's up there. Select that. Before you bring it in, import as composition, and you retain layer sizes. Say open. When you're done, what you should have, if you have the right settings, you should have mouth shapes composition along with a folder of all the different poses. And I'll hold there for a moment. What's that? 29's fine. 29 frames a second's fine. 30, yeah, that's fine. I suppose that's the other thing. I mean, you can use fewer frames a second for what we're doing. I tend to do everything at 30, so, or 29 or 30, so. So once you've got that imported, if you open that mouth shapes composition, you should have that. And all of these sounds are actually on this layer 1 down here. You can just turn that off. And then within that mouth shape, select all of these layers. I'll just shift click, select them in the timeline, grab all of those. Yes. And then go over to, go away. Over here on the left-hand side, you should have align as an option. Set align layers to composition and just center them horizontally and vertically so that they're all over top of each other. And don't deselect your layers yet. So we've got them all centered up over top of each other. While they're all still selected, hit Option or Alt on your keyboard and the right bracket. And that'll convert all of those. You'll see your timeline, that'll convert all of those to a single frame. And we're going to do two other things here just to make this more workable. So with all of those selected, we've condensed them down to a single frame. If you right-click on that, go under Keyframe Assistant, and at the very bottom, Sequence Layers. And just say OK. And that'll sequence all of those one after another. So if you take your playhead here and just sort of slide it through, you should have the individual poses. And the last two things we want to do is we want to crop this composition, the length, down to just these frames. So I'm just going to grab the second bar here and slide that down to the very end of the last frame, like that. And then go to Composition and Trim Comp to the work area. You should end up with this when you're finished. And the only other two things to do, this little region of interest icon, if you click on it, and then I'll switch back to black so I can see what I'm doing. If you just click and drag around sort of a crop area, and then you can go back to composition and crop comp to the region of interest, and that'll make it smaller. Get rid of all that extra space. Then I'm just going to line that top lip real quick. If you tap R on your Command R on your keyboard, it'll bring up your rulers and drag a guide down to the top lip. And we'll just go through and kind of position each of these. Make sure you select the pose you're working on, though. Don't do like I did the first time and keep them all selected and move them all together. Each time you want to make an adjustment, just select that segment, slide it up or down. And the last one. That's the setup on the mouth comp. Anybody miss part of that, or do I need to do a part of it again? Like I said, there's instructions too on Canvas. It's all written out. It's actually this document right here. So now that we've done all of that, we need a composition to place it into, finish off setting up the rig, and that you can animate within. So I'm just going to create another composition, 1920 by 1080. Make it 6 seconds, 5 or 6 seconds long. It doesn't need to be long. 5. Say OK. And then just so we can see things easier, zoom out. I'm going to place a solid in my timeline. So just right click, new solid, and select the background color you like, something light. Okay. And then our mouth shapes comp, we're just going to drag down on there as well. And let's resize it. Kind of center it up. And now we finish up our rig setup with this. So we're going to start by selecting mouth shapes, go up to Effect, the Effect menu, and you're going to go down to Expression Controls, Slider Control, and select that. And it should give you this panel, bring up the effect panel with that slider in it. And then right click on your mouth shapes again after doing that. Go to Time and enable time remapping. So we applied 2 basic effects. We did time remapping as well as our slider control. So on time remapping, if you hold down the Option key and click on the stopwatch, that's going to open that expression bar. And once that's open, you're just going to grab this little pick whip down here, this little curly cue. Click on it. I'm just going to drag it up on top of this, connect it to this slider. So we've basically linked with an expression this time remap to this slider. So that's going to give us the control over our shapes. And then you should notice down here in your expression bar, Effect Slider Control Slider. We're going to edit that, modify it, and we're going to apply this effect to a variable, A. So you type A equal in front of it. And then if you go to the end of that line, put your cursor at the end of it, hit return. Just type frame, and you can either type frames to time or just go ahead and select this one from the pop-up. It'll give you the suggestions. Frames to time. And inside of the parentheses, put A. So we assigned to that variable A this effect slider control, and then we're mapping frames to time to that slider, is what it's doing. And now if you come up here to your slider, actually if you come to your slider right now and slide across, it's going to be kind of quick. You need to actually right click on that slider, edit the value, and we had 10 frames or 9 frames in our composition, our mouth shapes. So we're going to change the slider range from 0 and change the 100 to 9, because 9 frames is all that we have. Say OK. And now when you slide this along, I actually have one blank one at the end. So, again. So, with our slider, select that. We're just going to set an initial keyframe down here in our timeline. Right-click on it and select Toggle Hold Keyframe, which is just gonna, when the playhead hits that keyframe, it's gonna make the change and it's gonna hold it there until there's another keyframe within the timeline. And then I usually just stretch these out, although you don't really need to, I don't think. So now that's, so at this frame I'm going to slide this back to my, I'm just going to use this as my neutral pose. Slide it ahead a couple of keyframes. Just change the pose from the slider. So I'm sort of neutral or closed. I'm going to hit that L, A, hold that for a bit, and come over to here. And slide that back to neutral. So the alphabet that I had, I found it, well, back up real quick. So we set up that mouth rig. If you want to create your own set of mouth poses, just draw those out. Prepare the file just the way I had that Illustrator file or even the PSD file. All the poses on separate layers. And then you create the mouth rig in exactly the same way that we just did it. Save that mouth rig. I mean, it's kind of tedious setting it up. Takes a little bit of time, but once you're done, it really is just a simple process of importing a sound bite, looking at the waveform, and applying the appropriate mouth shape to the different points in order to set up that lip sync movement. So save that. I mean, we can, if I want to use this over and over again, I'll just save this comp as my mouth rig. And then if I create a new project, I can import a file. I'll just import that mouth rig file. All the assets will be inside of a folder. Open this comp up. Select my mouth shapes, copy that, and I can create a new composition. Paste it in. If I've got any keyframes set, I'll have to go back and remove some of those. But My slider's all set up and I'm ready to go. So set it up once and try and reuse it. I mean, you can also do that if you have if you've got a standard, say 12 pose mouth rig, you could also draw different mouth shapes. As long as you've got 12 of them, you can replace those frames within your original mouth rig setup and not have to do all of the expression control and that kind of stuff again. Just sort of replace frames. Within Lipsync setup, this was just a very simple, like I said, 9 frames. Most are 12 to 14, somewhere in there. Bigger ones though might have, I mean, mine were all smiley mouth, mouth shapes. You might have a mix of, angry or sad mouth shapes in there that you can kind of work your way back and forth between. You're only setting the poses for the particular frames you want, so having more in there won't matter. And if you've got a mouth rig with 24 different poses in it, because you've got a happy set and a sad set, when you map the slider value, instead of setting that to 10 like we just did, or 9, you're going to set it to 12, if that's the number of frames you've got, or 24, however many frames are in your mouth setup. I found most of my clips from, there's a site, Looperman, that has at least the ABC, which I think is good. I mean, if you've never done lip sync before and it's something you want to try and, work with, I think doing the alphabet and the numbers is sort of a first time through is a good exercise because it's a simple kind of a thing to do. It's got a lot of very simple, A, E, I, O. I mean, you can focus on vowel sounds or specific letters. There's a couple in there that the way they're formed, you might want to sneak a couple of poses into, but it at least gets you used to the process, understanding the different phonetic sounds. And then when you go to another, you go find clips of other audio, you at least got the basis. And just work your way through it. I mean, I started with, I know where all of my neutral poses are. I set all of those neutral poses. And then I know where a sound starts. I might just go and plop a shape in there that I know is roughly right. Through it, take a listen to it, watch it, and make adjustments, then go, just slide back to a particular keyframe and make adjustments to that shape until it looks more natural and it feels more right. But, it's just kind of working your way through it. I think when you get done and you watch it and it looks the way it sounds and it feels right, I think is kind of a fun thing. So, you've got the mouth rig. We set that up. Take the time to kind of get used to it and to animate it. I mean, if you want to do it while you're here, that's fine, but, take the time outside of class. It's a good skill to have, and can be kind of fun at the same time once you're through all of the tedious setup work. Any questions about any of that or anything you want to see again? Yes, no? No. Yeah.
Did you say we could use Procreate?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can create, I mean, it's just a matter of creating individual mouth shapes. Use whatever program, whatever application you want to use, so long as you can get layers out of it and bring in that layer sequence. Yep. What's that?
Are we turning this in or
Just practice. You don't need to turn it in. But I do think before we're done here, we'll have something that'll include lip sync. So I think taking the time to get used to it now is worthwhile. So, but I would definitely do it. Yeah, I'm not going to make you turn it in. I do that with my InDesign and Illustrator classes. The in-class exercises we do, they have to turn in, but I don't do it here. I might change that next year. I don't know why I didn't do it with you guys, but it probably would have been better. So, but just work with it. It will be a decent skill, especially if you like animating. So I know a lot of you like, a lot of you, sketch. So it's a skill that, draw out your shapes however you want and bring them into After Effects. Then you can animate them any way you need. So, all right.